The biting wind whipped Ilara's threadbare shawl tighter around her, a flimsy defense against the chill of the dusty street and the colder dread icing her veins. Sold. The word was a brand seared into her soul, uttered with chilling finality by the man who was her father, his eyes hard as the coins he'd pocketed. Her worth, so easily measured, so casually dismissed. Before her stood her buyer, a silhouette against the harsh afternoon sun, a man whose name, Caleb Blackwood, was a murmur of fear in taverns, a legend whispered by firelight, the shadow of the Western Territories. Terror, raw and suffocating, clawed at Ilara's throat. What life awaited her in the hands of such a man, a killer, a ghost? And what of the secret life she carried, a fragile flutter beneath her heart, unknown to this grim reaper who had just purchased her very existence? Could any whisper of hope survive in the desolate landscape of his reputation, for a woman betrayed and a child conceived in a moment of stolen, fleeting tenderness, now the source of her deepest shame and her fiercest, most silent vow to protect? Ilara's gaze fell to the dust at her worn boots, each grain a testament to her insignificance. Her father, Josiah, a man whose piety was a cloak for cruelty, had cast her out, his pronouncements of her sin ringing in her ears louder than the jingle of Blackwood's payment. She was fallen, ruined, a blight to be excised. The townsfolk of Redemption, a name that mocked her current plight, watched from behind shuttered windows and parted curtains, their curiosity tinged with morbid satisfaction. Another sinner meeting a grim fate. Caleb Blackwood finally moved, his motion fluid and unnervingly quiet for a man of his size and rumored profession. He didn't speak to her, merely gestured with a gloved hand towards a sturdy horse tethered nearby, its saddlebags laden with supplies. His face remained in shadow beneath the brim of his hat, but Ilara felt his gaze, intense and assessing, strip away her defenses until only her quivering fear remained. This was her new reality, no choices, no voice, only obedience to a man whose past was written in violence. As she took a hesitant step, the life within her gave a gentle stir, a poignant reminder of all she stood to lose, and the desperate, impossible need to find a way to survive. The question echoed in the desolate chambers of her heart, what future could there be, purchased by a feared gunslinger, for a woman deemed worthless, yet carrying the most precious, vulnerable miracle? The journey was a blur of stark landscapes and suffocating silence. Ilara rode a placid mare Caleb Blackwood provided, her body aching with a fatigue that went deeper than muscle and bone. He rode ahead, a formidable figure on his dark stallion, his back a wall of indifference. The sun beat down relentlessly, mirroring the parched emptiness within her. Each hoofbeat on the dry earth seemed to count down the moments to an unknown, terrifying destination. She tried to make herself small, to become invisible, her senses perpetually alert for any sign of aggression, any hint of the cruelty she anticipated. Yet, he offered no violence, no leering words, only an unsettling quiet. At midday, he stopped by a meager stream, its water a thin ribbon in the cracked earth. He dismounted, his movements economical, and gestured for her to do the same. He offered her a canteen and a piece of dried jerky from his saddlebag. Ilara accepted with a mumbled word of thanks, her eyes downcast, unable to meet his gaze. The jerky was tough, the water lukewarm, but it was sustenance, and a strange, reluctant seed of confusion began to sprout amidst her fear. This was not the brute she had envisioned. His silence was unnerving, yes, but it was not laced with the overt menace she had steeled herself against. He ate little himself, his attention mostly on the horizon, his vigilance a palpable force. She wondered about the secret she carried, the gentle swell of her belly still mostly concealed by the loose fit of her dress. How long before he noticed? What would he do? The fear of that discovery was a constant, gnawing companion. As dusk began to paint the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, they crested a small rise. Below, nestled in a shallow, wind-scoured valley, was a cabin. It was small, starkly simple, built of rough-hewn logs, a thin plume of smoke rising from its stone chimney, suggesting a recent fire, or perhaps an occupant he hadn't mentioned. A wave of fresh terror washed over her. Was this where her nightmare would truly begin? The cabin looked isolated, utterly cut off from the world, a place where screams would go unheard. Caleb dismounted and, without a word, led his horse towards the cabin, leaving Ilara to follow, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, each beat echoing the desolation of her new, purchased life. The interior of Caleb Blackwood's cabin was as stark and unadorned as the man himself, yet surprisingly clean. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the single room, a stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a narrow bed occupied a corner, its blankets neatly folded. There were no feminine touches, no softness, only the bare essentials of a solitary existence. Elara stood uncertainly by the door, her hands clutching her shawl, unsure of her place, her purpose. Caleb lit a lantern, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to accentuate his formidable presence. "There's a pallet and blankets there," he said, his voice a low rumble, gesturing towards the opposite corner. "You can sleep there. The well is out back. There's food in the pantry." His instructions were practical, devoid of emotion, yet they were not commands barked at a slave. He unbuckled his gun belt, hanging it on a peg by the door, an action that somehow made him seem slightly less menacing, though the aura of danger still clung to him. Elara nodded, her throat too tight for words. She watched as he moved about the small space, preparing a simple meal of beans and bacon. The aroma, humble as it was, made her stomach clench with a hunger she hadn't realized she felt. He offered her a plate, and she accepted, sitting tentatively on one of the hard chairs. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clinking of forks against tin plates and the crackle of the fire he'd rekindled. It was the most unnerving meal of her life. Later, as she lay on the surprisingly comfortable pallet, the sounds of the wilderness outside pressing in, she replayed his words. He had not laid a hand on her, had not spoken a cruel word. He had provided food and shelter. It was a far cry from the brutality she had braced herself for, yet the uncertainty was a torment in itself. What did he want from her? The next morning, she rose early, driven by a restless energy and a desperate need to prove some small worth, if only to herself. She found an old, worn shirt of his, torn at the sleeve, lying on a stool. Hesitantly, she picked it up, found a needle and thread in a small tin box on a shelf, and began to mend it. The simple, repetitive motion was calming. When Caleb entered from outside, his expression was unreadable as he saw her, mending his shirt. He merely nodded, a flicker of something, surprise? In his eyes before it was gone. He didn't question her, didn't stop her. And in that small, unspoken allowance, Elara felt the faintest, most fragile stirring of something other than pure terror. The day settled into a strange, silent rhythm. Elara cooked, cleaned, and mended, her hands finding solace in familiar tasks that brought a semblance of order to the stark cabin and a fragile calm to her own frayed nerves. Caleb worked outside from dawn till dusk, tending a small patch of land, hunting, or simply disappearing into the wilderness for hours, always returning with a quiet intensity that kept her on edge. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his words were few, practical, never unkind, but never warm either. Elara's secret, however, was becoming a heavier burden with each passing week. The morning sickness, once a fleeting queasiness, now gripped her with undeniable force. She tried to hide it, slipping away behind the cabin, her body racked with heaves, her spirit sinking with shame and fear. But one morning, she was not quick enough. As she scrubbed furiously at a pot, a wave of nausea overwhelmed her, and she barely made it to the door before vomiting into the dust. When she straightened, weak and trembling, Caleb was standing there, his face impassive, his eyes, those piercing grey eyes, fixed on her. The silence stretched, taut and terrible. This was it, she thought, the moment of reckoning. He would cast her out, or worse. The harsh judgment she had fled from her father would now be delivered by this silent, formidable man. "You are with child," he stated, his voice flat, devoid of accusation, yet heavy with an unspoken weight. It wasn't a question. Elara could only nod, tears welling in her eyes, shame burning her cheeks. She braced herself for the condemnation, for the disgust she felt she deserved. "Who is the father?" he asked, his gaze unwavering. She shook her head, unable to speak the name of the boy who had whispered sweet promises and then vanished like smoke, leaving her to face the consequences alone. "He's gone," she finally choked out, the words tasting like ash. Caleb continued to watch her, his expression unreadable. She expected anger, revulsion, perhaps even a cold dismissal. Instead, he slowly nodded, a strange light dawning in his usually shadowed eyes. He looked not at her belly, but into her face, searching, it seemed, for something she couldn't name. Then, he turned and walked back towards the field he was clearing, leaving her standing there, trembling, not with fear of immediate violence, but with a profound, bewildering uncertainty. His lack of condemnation was more unsettling than any rage could have been. What did this man truly want from her, this child she carried? Caleb swung the axe, the rhythmic thud against stubborn pine a counterpoint to the turmoil in his own chest. A child. Ilara was carrying a child. The words echoed in the silence of his self-imposed exile, stirring embers he thought long dead. Years ago, this very cabin had echoed with the laughter of his beloved Mary, her belly swollen with their firstborn. Then came the fever, swift and merciless, stealing both Mary and their infant son before Caleb had even truly held him, leaving behind an emptiness so vast it had hollowed him out, turning him into the shadow of a man. He had prayed then, raw, desperate prayers to a God he wasn't sure listened, prayed for a sign, for solace, for life to find meaning again. The prayers had faded into the bitter dust of unanswered longing, replaced by the cold steel of his guns and the desolate path of a man with nothing left to lose. Now, this. A woman sold to him, a stranger carrying another man's child, had unknowingly brought the very thing he had once begged heaven for into his desolate home. It was a cruel jest, perhaps, or something far more profound. He watched Ilara from a distance as she moved about her chores, her initial terror slowly giving way to a quiet resilience. He saw the gentle curve of her stomach beneath her worn dress, a silent testament to the life she nurtured. There was a fragility about her, yes, but also an undeniable strength, a quiet dignity that her father's cruelty and her current predicament had failed to extinguish. He had bought her, true, a transaction that now tasted like ash in his mouth. He had sought, he wasn't sure what he had sought. A presence to fill the crushing silence, perhaps. A penance. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected the flicker of protectiveness that stirred within him, an instinct he thought buried with Mary. The child was not his by blood, yet the thought of it, of new life within these walls, was a fragile, terrifying seed of hope. He found himself leaving an extra apple on the table, ensuring the woodpile was always high, subtle gestures of care he barely acknowledged to himself. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with the judgments of the outside world and the ghosts of his own past, but for the first time in years, Caleb Blackwood felt something other than the cold, hard edge of survival. A dangerous, tentative warmth was beginning to thaw the frozen landscape of his heart. The journey to the small settlement of Redemption Creek for supplies was a necessity Caleb had postponed as long as possible. He knew the whispers that followed him, the fear his name evoked. Now, with Ilara, visibly pregnant, at his side, those whispers would become a clamor of speculation and judgment. Ilara, dressed in a mended but clean dress Caleb had silently left for her, felt the stairs like physical blows as they rode down the dusty main street. Faces peered from behind store windows, conversations hushed as they passed. Caleb's reputation was a dark cloak, and she, beside him, was tainted by its shadow. At Miller's Mercantile, the air grew thick with unspoken questions. Mr. Miller, a portly man with nervous eyes, avoided Caleb's gaze, his attention skittering to Ilara's swollen form before quickly looking away. "Supplies, Blackwood?" he asked, his voice tight. Caleb handed him the list, his expression unreadable. As Miller gathered the items, his wife, Martha, a woman with kind eyes and a weary face, emerged from the back. Her gaze lingered on Ilara, not with the harsh judgment of the others, but with a flicker of something softer, perhaps empathy. "Good day," Martha said quietly, offering a small, hesitant smile. Ilara, startled by the unexpected kindness, managed a weak, good day later. As Caleb loaded the supplies, Ilara waited near the horses, acutely aware of two women gossiping not 10 feet away, their voices sharp with condemnation. Bought her, they say, carrying another's shame. What decent woman would end up with a man like Blackwood? Tears pricked Ilara's eyes, the familiar sting of worthlessness threatening to overwhelm her. Suddenly, Caleb was there, his presence alone enough to silence the women, who scurried away like startled mice. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge them, but simply helped Ilara mount her horse, his touch surprisingly gentle on her arm. As they rode out of Redemption Creek, the accusing stares followed them. Ilara felt a fresh wave of despair, but beneath it, a small, stubborn ember of gratitude flickered. Caleb had not defended her with words, but his silent, formidable presence had been a shield. And Martha Miller's small smile, a tiny beacon in the overwhelming darkness of societal scorn, reminded her that not all hearts were made of stone. The world was cruel, but perhaps, just perhaps, pockets of kindness could still be found, even for a woman like her. Back within the secluded valley, a fragile peace began to settle over the small cabin. The harsh judgments of Redemption Creek faded with the miles, replaced by the familiar sounds of the wilderness and the quiet rhythm of their shared, unspoken existence. Ilara, her body growing heavier with the advancing pregnancy, found a surprising contentment in her daily tasks. She coaxed a small herb garden to life near the cabin door, the tender green shoots a vibrant splash of color against the weathered logs, a symbol of new beginnings she scarcely dared to hope for. The cabin, once so stark, began to feel more like a home under her touch. She mended curtains from old flour sacks, their cheerful, rustic pattern brightening the single room. The aroma of baking bread often filled the air, a scent Caleb seemed to visibly soften to, though he never commented directly. He continued his stoic routine, but Ilara noticed subtle changes. He would leave a pail of fresh well water by the door for her each morning, saving her the arduous task. Sometimes, in the evenings, as she sat knitting tiny garments from scraps of wool Martha Miller had quietly pressed into her hand, she would catch him watching her, a look in his eyes she couldn't quite decipher, a mixture of sorrow, contemplation, and something akin to wonder. One evening, a fierce storm swept through the valley, the wind howling like a banshee, rain lashing against the cabin. The thunder was deafening, and Ilara, despite herself, flinched with each earth-shaking clap. Caleb, who had been oiling his rifle by the firelight, looked up. He saw her fear, the way she clutched her swollen belly. Without a word, he rose and added another log to the fire, the flames leaping higher, casting a warmer, more comforting glow. He didn't offer platitudes, but his steady presence, his calm amidst the storm's fury, was a reassurance more profound than any words could have been. A letter, weeks old, had arrived with the supplies from Redemption Creek, passed on by a reluctant postmaster. It bore her father's spidery script. Caleb had handed it to her without comment. She hadn't opened it yet, the very sight of it a cold knot of dread in her stomach. Her father was not a man to let go, especially if he sensed there was something, or someone, he could still control or exploit. The peace they had found felt as fragile as a soap bubble, beautiful but easily broken. The unopened letter from her father lay on the small shelf like a coiled serpent, its presence a constant, low hum of anxiety beneath the quiet surface of Ilara's days. She knew its contents would bring nothing but pain, yet the not knowing was a torment of its own. Caleb never mentioned it, his quiet respect for her autonomy a stark contrast to her father's suffocating control. One crisp autumn morning, as Ilara tended her small herb garden, she saw him. Josiah, her father, riding towards the cabin, not alone, but flanked by two grim-faced men she recognized from their church, men whose piety was as judgmental and unyielding as his own. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Ilara. She straightened, her hand instinctively going to her belly, a protective gesture that was now second nature. Caleb emerged from the small barn, his movements unhurried, but his eyes, when they met hers, were alert, watchful. He had seen them too. Josiah reined in his horse a short distance from the cabin, his gaze sweeping over Ilara, lingering on her swollen form with an expression of profound distaste. Ilara, he boomed, his voice carrying the righteous anger she knew so well. You will come with us. I have come to save your soul from this den of iniquity and this godless man. I am not going anywhere, Father, Ilara said, her voice trembling but firm. The word surprised even herself. Weeks ago, she would have cowered, but something had changed within her, nurtured by Caleb's silent acceptance and the growing life within her. This is my home now, Josiah's face purpled with rage. Home? With a killer? A man who bought you like livestock? You are shaming our name, girl. That child you carry is a mark of your sin, and you will repent. The only shame here is yours, father, Ilara shot back, a surge of unexpected courage flooding through her. You sold me. You cast me out. You have no claim on me, or my child. Caleb stepped forward then, positioning himself slightly in front of Ilara. He didn't draw his weapon, but his presence was a palpable warning. The lady has made her wishes clear, he said, his voice low and steady, yet carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. She stays. You will leave. One of Josiah's companions, a burly man named Brother Silas, sneered. And who are you to tell us, Blackwood? A murderer hiding from justice. The confrontation hung heavy in the air, the fragile peace of the valley shattered. Josiah's eyes, burning with a fanatical gleam, fixed on Caleb. You will not keep my daughter, Blackwood. She is my blood. That child she carries, born of sin, still needs guidance away from the path of wickedness you represent. He dismounted, his companions following suit, their expressions hard and unyielding. It was clear they had not come merely to talk. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, but a strange resolve settled over her. This was her life now, her child's life, and she would not let her father's twisted righteousness destroy it. I will not let you take me, she repeated, her voice clearer this time, stronger. This man, she gestured towards Caleb, has shown me more kindness and decency than you ever did. Father. Caleb's hand rested near the worn butt of his Colt, his stance relaxed but radiating a deadly readiness. You heard her, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. This is your only warning. Mount up and ride out. Brother Silas, emboldened by his own sense of moral superiority, took a step forward. We came for the girl, Blackwood. And we ain't leaving without her. In a movement so swift it was almost a blur, Caleb's gun was in his hand, not aimed, but held with an authority that brooked no argument. I believe you are, he stated, the click of the hammer being cocked a sharp, definitive sound in the sudden silence. Josiah faltered, his bluster dimming slightly in the face of Caleb's lethal calm. He had expected a cowering girl and a man who would perhaps bluster but ultimately yield to their perceived moral authority. He had not anticipated this quiet, unshakable resolve, nor the raw courage emanating from Ilara herself. The second man, Brother Enoch, younger and clearly less committed to martyrdom, looked nervously from Caleb to Josiah. It was Ilara who broke the standoff, not with violence, but with a quiet strength that disarmed them more effectively than any threat. Go home, father, she said, her voice weary but firm. There is nothing for you here. I have found my place. My child will be born here, in peace, not under the shadow of your judgment. Her words, spoken with such conviction, seemed to momentarily stun Josiah. He looked at his daughter, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time seeing not a possession or a sinner, but a woman transformed. The fight seemed to drain from him, replaced by a bewildered anger. With a snarl of frustration, he turned. You will regret this, Ilara. You will burn for this choice. He remounted, his companions, visibly relieved, scrambling to follow. They rode away, not with the triumphant air of saviors, but with the bitter taste of defeat, leaving behind a silence even more profound than before, a silence filled with the unspoken bond between a woman who had found her strength and a man who had chosen to stand by her. The dust settled, and the figures of Josiah and his men dwindled in the distance, finally disappearing over the rise. Ilara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her legs suddenly weak. Caleb holstered his weapon, the metallic click echoing softly in the quiet aftermath. He turned to her, his grey eyes searching her face, a question in their depths. Are you all right? He asked, his voice gentle, stripped of its earlier menace. She nodded, a watery smile touching her lips. Yes. Thank you, Caleb. The words felt inadequate for the enormity of what he had just done, for the way he had stood as a bulwark between her and the crushing weight of her past. He had not just protected her physically, he had validated her choice, her newfound sense of self. He simply nodded, a characteristic economy of gesture, yet there was a warmth in his gaze that made her heart ache with a complex mix of gratitude and a dawning, deeper emotion. The immediate threat had passed, but the confrontation had irrevocably changed the landscape of their relationship. The unspoken had been spoken, lines had been drawn and defended. Later that day, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of rose and lavender, Ilara found Caleb by the small corral, mending a fence rail. She brought him a cup of warm cider, the scent of apples and cinnamon a comforting aroma in the cool evening air. "Caleb," she began, then hesitated, unsure how to voice the feelings swirling within her. He took the cup, his fingers brushing hers, a brief, warm contact that sent a surprising shiver through her. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "For me." For the child he looked out at the land, his land, their shared sanctuary. "This place," he said, his voice thoughtful, "it was empty for a long time. You brought life back to it, Ilara." Both of you. He met her gaze then, and she saw not the feared gunslinger, but a man of profound loneliness who had found an unexpected solace. The miracle he had perhaps unknowingly prayed for wasn't just a child, it was the mending of a shattered life, the return of hope, the possibility of family. As winter approached, bringing with it a blanket of cleansing snow, the cabin became a true haven. The birth of her child, a healthy son with a thatch of dark hair, arrived with the first thaw of spring. Caleb was there, his large hand surprisingly gentle as he helped her, his face transformed by an awe and tenderness that brought tears to Ilara's eyes. He held the infant, his gaze filled with a wonder that mirrored her own. They named him Samuel, meaning God has heard. In the quiet joy of their new family, the shadows of the past began to recede, replaced by the promise of a future built on courage, acceptance, and a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. Martha Miller, true to her kind heart, visited with her husband, bringing gifts and well wishes, the first fragile bridge to a community that might, one day, see Caleb not as the shadow, but as a man who had found redemption, and Ilara not as a fallen woman, but as the heart of a home, her worth finally, undeniably, confirmed.